I never thought I'd live long enough to hear my own son tell me I wasn't welcome at his wedding. After everything I'd done, after decades of working my hands raw on the factory floor in Detroit, after missing birthdays and holidays so he could have a college education I never dreamed of, that's what I got. A text message at 62 years old, sitting alone in my kitchen telling me I was too much of an embarrassment to stand by his side on the most important day of his life. Before we continue, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. I stared at that message for a long time, longer than I'd like to admit. The clock on the microwave blinked 11:47 p.m. The house was dead quiet, and my dog, Max, was curled up at my feet, the only living thing that hadn't turned its back on me. My first instinct was to tell myself it didn't matter. Maybe the ceremony wasn't for me anyway. But then I thought about all the nights I'd worked double shifts at the Ford plant so my son, Daniel, could go to the University of Michigan debt-free. I thought about how I pawned my old guitar, the one my late wife loved, just to cover his first year's dorm deposit. And now he didn't even want me in the room. The next morning I brewed a pot of Folgers, poured it into the chipped mug I've had since the 80s, and tried to convince myself I'd move on. That was when the second blow landed. Sitting right there in my mailbox was a thick envelope. I ripped it open, thinking maybe, just maybe, it was an apology. Instead, I unfolded a crisp invoice printed on letterhead from a Napa Valley wedding planner. Total due $200,000. At the top of the page, in bold letters, it said, "Father of the groom contribution." I almost laughed. At first, I thought it was some kind of clerical error. But then I flipped through the itemized list. $35,000 for floral arrangements flown in from New York, $50,000 for the vineyard venue, $12,000 for an open bar stocked with Dom Perignon, even an $18,000 line for the bridal gown. It was like reading a stranger's shopping spree, except it was addressed to me. I called Daniel. No answer. Left a voicemail. Nothing. Finally, 2 days later, he sent a text. "This is how it works, Dad. Families contribute. Don't make it a big deal. That's all I got. No, please. No, thank you. Just an assumption that I would hand over 200 grand like I had it sitting under my mattress. Here's the part I haven't told anyone. I don't have $200,000 lying around. I have a modest retirement account, sure. A little equity in my house. But not that kind of money. And even if I did, after being uninvited to the wedding, what made him think I'd still be willing? That question gnawed at me because deep down I already knew the answer. Daniel never saw me as a man. He saw me as a wallet. Then came the first twist. As I looked closer at the invoice, one line item jumped out at me. A $7,500 security deposit to a company I'd never heard of. Something about it didn't sit right. I scribbled the name down, thinking I'd check it later, but in my gut, I already knew it was shady. That night, I pulled out an old box of paperwork. My late wife, God bless her, had kept meticulous records. Bank statements, old tax returns, copies of every loan we ever signed. And tucked between them was something I had almost forgotten. A letter from Daniel's first credit card application years ago. I remembered co-signing for him back then, against my better judgment. He promised he'd be responsible. Looking at that invoice now, I realized just how naive I had been. I poured myself a glass of Jack Daniels, sat back in my recliner, and let the anger settle into something colder. This wasn't just about the wedding anymore. It was about a son who thought he could cut me out of his life and still treat me like a cash machine. I held that invoice in my hands one more time. My fingers traced the bold numbers at the bottom. $200,000. Then I whispered to myself, "If that's how you see me, Daniel, then I'll treat you like any other debtor." And that's when I knew. I wasn't just going to ignore the bill. I was going to make him regret ever sending it to me. When I walked into the bank that Monday morning, the autumn chill still clung to my jacket. Detroit mornings have a way of cutting straight through you, and this one felt colder than most. I sat down across from a young loan officer who looked like he could have been my son's classmate in college. I slid the invoice across the desk and asked a simple question. Can you check if my name is tied to any new accounts? He typed for a while, frowning at the screen. Then he looked up at me with a careful tone, like a doctor about to give bad news. Sir, it looks like you're listed as a cosigner on a joint credit account. Opened last year, limits already maxed. My stomach dropped. I never signed anything last year. I asked him to pull the paperwork. When the file came back, my blood ran hot. My signature was on it, but it wasn't mine. Daniel had forged it. My own son had faked my name to open a line of credit, then buried me under $200,000 of luxury bills. I drove home gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. All those nights of overtime, the missed baseball games, the cheap vacations we took in beat-up Chevys, while I told him someday he'd have better. Suddenly they felt like a cruel joke. The boy I raised had turned me into his safety net without even asking. I poured myself another cup of coffee, but it tasted bitter, metallic, like guilt. Because here's the ugly part. Some of this was on me. I taught him I'd always be there to fix things. I covered his speeding tickets in high school, paid off his college credit card when he went wild freshman year. Maybe I'd taught him too well that Dad would always clean up the mess. Still, fraud was another level. I picked up the phone and dialed him, straight to voicemail, again and again. Finally, late that night, I got a text. Just 6 words. Stop overreacting. This is normal? Normal to erase your father from your wedding guest list, then saddle him with a debt bigger than his entire retirement savings? I read those words until the letters blurred and something inside me hardened. That's when I remembered the odd detail on the invoice, the $7,500 security deposit to a company with a name I didn't recognize. So I did what any stubborn old man would do. I pulled out my reading glasses, opened my laptop, and started digging. The company wasn't a real vendor at all. It was an LLC registered in California under the bride's maiden name, a shell account. They weren't just billing me. They were funneling money into their own pockets under the guise of wedding expenses. That invoice wasn't just a plea for help. It was a scam, dressed up in white lace and roses. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glow of the screen. My son hadn't just lied to me. He'd teamed up with his fiancée to con me. That cut deeper than the band from the wedding. It meant he'd chosen greed over blood, and he'd done it with a smile. For a moment, I thought about calling the police right then. But another thought slipped in, darker and quieter. What if I let him walk right into the trap he built? What if, instead of bailing him out like always, I simply stepped back and let the walls close in? The moral debate kept me awake until dawn. Was it my duty as a father to protect him, even from his own stupidity and malice? Or was it finally time to let him face the consequences like any other grown man? I walked out onto the porch just as the sun rose, the cold air biting at my face. My neighbor, old Mr. Johnson, was shoveling leaves from his driveway. He waved, and for a moment I envied his simple, quiet life. Then I looked down at the crumpled invoice in my hand and knew mine was about to get a whole lot louder. I folded the paper neatly, slid it into a folder with my wife's old records, and whispered to myself, "No more rescues, Daniel." Because in that moment, the decision was made. I wasn't going to call the police yet. I was going to call someone else, someone who knew exactly how to use fraud against the person committing it. I picked up my phone, scrolled to a number I hadn't dialed in years, and pressed call. When the familiar voice of my old family lawyer answered, I said just 7 words. "It's time to settle accounts, Frank." Frank's voice hadn't changed much in 20 years. Steady, deliberate, the kind of voice that used to calm my wife when bills stacked up higher than the paychecks. I explained everything. The fake signature, the credit line, the shell company under the bride's name. I half expected him to scold me, tell me to forgive, to chalk it up to family business. Instead, there was a long silence on the line. Then he said, You've got him cold. But the question is, do you want to bury him or teach him? That question sat heavy in my chest, because as much as I wanted to slam the door on Daniel, a piece of me still remembered the boy who used to fall asleep in the back seat of my Chevy after Little League, glove still on his hand. But now that boy had grown into a man who thought his father was nothing more than a blank check. Frank walked me through the options. We could file a fraud complaint immediately, freeze the accounts, drag Daniel into court. It would be public, messy, humiliating. Or we could wait, let the wedding go forward, and pull the rug out at the precise moment when the world was watching. That second option twisted something in me. It sounded cruel, even vindictive. But then I remembered how Daniel had laughed off my calls, dismissed my pain with, "This is normal." If betrayal had a face, it was his smirk behind those words. I told Frank to start the paperwork. He didn't argue, just said, "Then we'll need to time this right." The next week was a blur of signatures, notarized documents, and visits to the bank. Each time I held a pen, I thought about my wife. She would have hated this. She believed family could always be fixed with patience, but patience had turned me into a fool. One evening, I stopped at the old diner near Woodward Avenue, where she and I used to split cherry pie after long shifts. The waitress, a woman about my age with tired eyes, poured me coffee and asked how I'd been. I almost lied. Instead, I told her the truth, every ugly detail. When I finished, she just shook her head and said, "You raise them, but you don't own what they become." That hit me harder than I expected. Maybe this wasn't just about revenge. Maybe it was about admitting my son had chosen who he was, and it wasn't the man I'd hoped for. The deeper Frank dug, the worse it got. The shell company wasn't the only fraud. Daniel had also listed me as a guarantor on his fiancée's student loans. Another $40,000 hanging over my name. I felt sick, like I'd been sleepwalking through the last decade while he quietly built a house of debt on my shoulders. Here's the part that split me in two. I still caught myself making excuses for him. Maybe he was desperate. Maybe the fiancé pushed him. Maybe I hadn't taught him enough about respect. The guilt coiled around me, whispering that if I pulled the trigger on this, I wasn't just ending his wedding, I was ending my family. But then I looked at the numbers. 200 grand, 40 more. My retirement, my house, the little I had left of a life I'd worked for, gone if I stayed silent. He hadn't just stolen my money, he'd stolen my future. The night before Frank filed the injunction, I sat in my living room with Max at my feet, invoice spread across the coffee table. I imagined walking into that vineyard in Napa, seeing my son in his tux, smiling at guests while thinking he'd gotten away with it. And I imagined the moment his smile cracked, when he realized every bill had bounced, every vendor was demanding cash up front, and the whole charade was crumbling. It wasn't joy I felt, it was something darker, colder, but honest. For once he wouldn't get to play me. For once I'd be the one teaching him a lesson. Still, I couldn't shake the echo of Frank's question. Bury him or teach him? Maybe there was a way to do both. I closed the folder, turned off the light, and whispered into the dark house. "Tomorrow, Daniel, you'll learn what it means when Dad finally says no." And with that, I knew there was no turning back. The trap was set. All that was left was to wait for the wedding day. The morning of the wedding, I flew into San Francisco with nothing but a carry-on and a folder of documents tucked under my arm. Napa Valley was a 2-hour drive north, the kind of place you see on glossy magazine covers, rolling hills, perfect rows of grapevines, the scent of money clinging to the air. I rented a beat-up Ford Fusion at the airport, the kind of car that looked painfully out of place among the black SUVs and polished Teslas that lined the vineyard parking lot. As I pulled in, I could see the chaos already starting to simmer. The florist's van was parked at the entrance. Doors swung open, workers hauling out buckets of roses but refusing to step inside. A woman in a headset was waving her arms, shouting at them to just get the arrangements in place. I recognized her. She was listed on the invoice as the event planner. Her voice cracked as she yelled, "We don't set a single stem until we get a wire transfer." The account is frozen. I stayed back at the edge of the lot, leaning against my car, watching the cracks spread. It was almost noon, the sun high and merciless, and guests were arriving in pressed suits and dresses, confusion written across their faces. They passed by workers whispering about non-payment and canceled cards. I felt the tension in my chest ease just slightly. For once, I wasn't the one scrambling to patch things up. For once, I wasn't reaching for my wallet to keep appearances alive. Then I saw Daniel, my son dressed in a tuxedo worth more than my car, pacing by the vineyard gates with a phone pressed to his ear. His face was red, jaw tight, sweat beading at his temple. The same boy who once begged me for $20 to take a girl to the movies was now begging some faceless banker to extend a credit line that no longer existed. I stepped forward, just enough for him to see me. His eyes locked on mine, and for the first time in years, I saw fear flicker there. Not anger, not arrogance, fear. He ended the call without saying goodbye, shoving the phone into his pocket. "What the hell did you do?" he hissed, storming toward me. I didn't move. I just pulled the folder from under my arm and held it up between us. "Fraud complaint. Account freeze. Filed last week. Every vendor here has been notified." His face drained of color. Around us, the murmur of guests was growing louder as word spread. Some clutched their glasses of champagne. Others craned their necks to watch the drama unfolding by the gates. "You ruined me," Daniel spat. "Do you know how this looks?" "Yes," I said, voice steady. "That's the point." A ripple of silence hung between us. I could see his fiancée approaching from the main hall, her gown trailing behind her like a cloud, makeup flawless, eyes wide with panic. She clutched her phone too, scrolling frantically. "They're saying none of the payments went through." She whispered to him, loud enough for me to hear. "What's happening, Daniel?" For once he didn't have an answer. Vendors started pulling out, florists loading roses back into the van, caterers slamming trays shut, even the string quartet quietly packing their instruments. The illusion was collapsing in real time. Guests who had flown in from New York, Chicago, even overseas began whispering, pulling out their own phones, recording what looked like the implosion of a fairy tale wedding. And me? I stood there, calm, a rock in the middle of a storm I hadn't created, but had finally stopped cleaning up. My son wanted me erased from his life, but here I was, the one man who couldn't be ignored. He lunged closer, teeth gritted, voice low. "You could have just said no." "Why'd you have to humiliate me?" I leaned in, close enough for him to smell the coffee on my breath, and answered, "Because if I'd just said no, you would have found another way to stick me with the bill. This way the world sees who you really are." The words landed harder than a punch. His fiancée's parents had joined the circle now, their faces a mix of shock and fury. Her father, a man with a thick silver watch and a voice that could cut glass, barked, "You dragged our daughter into this mess?" I didn't need to add a thing. The avalanche had already started. Guests began leaving, murmuring about wasted flights, wasted money. The event planner sat on a crate, head in her hands. And my son, my only child, stood in the middle of it all, tuxedo jacket flapping in the warm Napa wind, reputation crumbling faster than the floral arches being hauled away. I turned, walked back toward my rental car, and as I reached for the door handle, I looked back just once. He was staring at me, lips trembling, unable to speak. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not joy, not triumph, but freedom. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and told myself this was only the beginning, because the wedding wasn't the only thing about to collapse. When I pulled out of that vineyard lot, I thought the show was over. I'd made my point. Daniel's grand wedding had collapsed in front of 200 witnesses, vendors, and in-laws. That should have been enough. But life has a way of reminding you that consequences don't stop where you plant them. 2 weeks later, I got a call from Frank. His voice was sharp, almost excited. The fraud complaint moved faster than expected. The DA's office picked it up. My heart pounded in my chest. I'd pictured humiliation, maybe debt collectors chasing him. But a criminal charge, that was something I hadn't truly believed would happen. Turns out the $7,500 security deposit to that shell company was the smoking gun. Once investigators saw my documents and traced the LLC back to the bride's name, they uncovered a trail of forged signatures and falsified statements. Not just on my account, on others too. My son and his fiancée hadn't been planning a wedding. They'd been running a scam. The twist came when the bride's family, embarrassed and furious, cut ties overnight. They called off the marriage, fired off angry statements to mutual friends, and left Daniel to take the fall alone. She fled back to California, and he was left in Michigan to face the charges. I remember sitting in the back of the courtroom months later, the stale scent of paper and polish in the air. Daniel shuffled in wearing a cheap suit, no ring on his finger, no bride at his side. Just a public defender and a face that looked 10 years older than when I'd last seen him. The judge read out words I never imagined I'd hear attached to my son. Credit card fraud, forgery, restitution. As they discussed sentencing, Daniel's eyes searched the room and landed on me. For a second I thought he'd glare with that same arrogance, but all I saw was a broken man, realizing the safety net was gone. When the gavel came down, he wasn't going to prison. He was handed probation, restitution payments, and a wrecked reputation. But to Daniel, it might as well have been life. His employer had already fired him after the story broke in the Detroit Free Press. Old friends wouldn't return his calls. Even the vineyard guests had shared videos online, clips of vendors pulling out and the bride's father shouting. His name was Mud. Walking out of that courthouse, I should have felt triumphant. And in a way, I did. But beneath it was something heavier. Grief. Because revenge doesn't erase blood. It doesn't stitch up years of love and sacrifice gone sour. It just makes the truth undeniable. That night, I sat on my porch with Max at my feet and thought about the long road that had brought me there. The overtime shifts, the bills, the nights alone after my wife died, and I realized something simple, something brutal. Love without respect is just a leash waiting to snap. I'd given my son everything, and he'd chosen to spit on it, and in letting him fall, I'd finally chosen myself. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Being a parent doesn't mean erasing your own worth. Sometimes the hardest act of love is stepping back and letting your child face the storm they created. Have you ever been in a situation where family loyalty collided with betrayal, and you had to decide whether to protect or to walk away? Share your story in the comments. I'd like to hear how others have faced that crossroads. And if this story touched you, stick around, because there are more truths, more reckonings, and more voices like mine that need to be heard.